I discovered that more than ever when I wrote my 2 sort of family biographies. But each person I spoke to or interviewed would give me a different story and a different version. And that's very, very challenging because you have to work out your truth, and it's complicated.
Hello, I'm Catherine Fairweather and welcome back to The Third Act, brought to you by Oriens, the gold standard in later living. I'm delighted to welcome Sofka Zinovieff to the show. Her own upbringing is full of the twists and turns that lend energy and intrigue to her wondrous writing, especially the plot of her latest novel, Stealing Dad. This is a tragicomedy about a dysfunctional family coming together in the wake of a parent's death. Of aristocratic Russian and English heritage, she now lives in Greece. We get together at Oriens to talk about the importance of ritual in a human life. Thank you so much for coming. I thought you'd flown in from Athens, but I'm glad to hear it's only Mornington Crescent. Tell us about where you live at the moment.
At the moment, I live mostly in Athens, and my relationship with Greece has been a really long one since I was a student and went there to do research as an anthropologist. But now I'm married to a Greek and have 2 grown-up half-Greek daughters, so that's my Greek side.
Are you a resident? Have you got a Greek passport?
Yeah, I do. I did it as quite early on, I think as a symbolic thing more than anything. Yes, I liked the idea, a bit like getting married.
Yes, it's a commitment, isn't it?
It's a commitment.
Yeah.
It's not that I've given up my British passport, so I'm very lucky and have both.
There's a lot of strength to be had from straddling both cultures, isn't there?
There really is, and I think I'm more and more aware of that, especially after Brexit.
God, you're lucky.
And thrown into the mix is my Russian grandparents on my father's side, so I was always brought up being told you're half Russian, and of course the name gives it away.
Of course.
Yeah.
Do you feel Russian at all?
I do feel Russian, but I think that what happened to me when I went travelling for the first time in Russia, which was by very strange coincidence the time I met Vasilis, my Greek husband. He was working in the Greek embassy, so it tied all the different things in. But there it emphasised to me how I'm not Russian, at least not in a modern sense. I am in terms of descent and certain emotions, but when I went there, I could tell that I looked Russian, and people would assume I was Russian, unlike in Greece, where I feel much more at home, but people assume I'm not Greek from the way I look. So I think all these bits and pieces, the older one gets, the more you can actually accept all these different sides to yourself, which maybe when you're younger or you want to have labels that put you to slot into one sort of pigeonhole. But I think there's a lot to be said for not having to have too many labels and for being a human wherever you are.
Yeah, absolutely. My husband always says to me when I'm jumping a queue that my anarchic side is very Greek, and he keeps shouting at me for not. He loves queuing. That is his very English side. I do not like queuing. But I would like to start not at the beginning of your life, but actually I'd like to start with endings, because your most recent book, Stealing Dad, which I've just read, is so moving, so funny, and I'd really like to talk about endings and how, as we move through time, it's the idea of seasons and limits and endings and saying goodbye that gives life meaning, I think. And that's very much a sense of that in this novel. Although novel, it's sort of a bit memoir, isn't it? Based on your own story.
Yes, exactly. It's not memoir in that I made up all the characters and made up the story, but it has its roots very directly in what happened to me when my father died. A very beloved father, but one with a very complicated life.
Russian father.
Russian, born in England, but both his parents had left after the Russian Revolution as children, met in England. And he had this very complicated but very creative, very interesting life, and was married 4 times and had periods where he was definitely alcoholic. He had 7 children from 3 marriages and left quite a lot of chaos behind him. But towards the end of his life, from about the age of 70, he settled down, got married for the 4th time, stopped drinking, became creative again, went back to the electronic computer music he'd loved. And this was wonderful to see. And I think it was something to do with this renaissance of his that made him think when he died he would leave a will saying that nobody would go to his funeral except for his 4th wife, and this included his 6 living children. I was the oldest and the closest, I'd say, to him. We'd always been close. I lived with him when my parents separated when I was a child.
Did you choose to, or was that just...
Yeah, I chose to. We got on very well, even in his difficult times. So it was a huge and unexpected shock to be left out. And what it did was make me examine a lot what it is about rituals, funerals, mourning customs, all of these things that I'd learnt about as an anthropologist. Why they matter so much, because yes, of course I was going to be very sad, devastated at my father dying, but I didn't understand why I would be devastated at not being able to go to his funeral. So none of us children were allowed to go. Our stepmother was adamant about that, and we felt very forlorn and very left out.
I bet.
And I wanted to explore that. I began immediately, even at a point where I couldn't really read books. I felt too upset, but I was taking notes and we were talking a lot. And amongst the tears and the upset and what can we do, there were some moments, as there always are at funerals, of laughter and jollity. And one of my brothers or sisters said, well, you know, seeing as we're not even allowed any ashes, the ashes are going to go in our stepmother's back garden. We're going to have a heist, climb over that wall one midnight and steal some ashes for ourselves. Yeah. And then somebody said, well, look, the funeral hasn't even happened yet. You know, we're not too late. We could go to the funeral home and just steal him and do our own thing. And it felt rather in the tradition of this wild, Russian, chaotic, passionate man that we might do something. I mean, of course we didn't.
But it translated into wonderful. The fantasy became your novel.
The fantasy became a novel, and it now feels sometimes talking, especially with my sisters, I think, almost as if that did happen and as if going down the generations, the story might remain that we did. But at another level, what was important for me was to think it all through. So to wonder why it is that we want these things. And I did a certain amount of research talking to people who gave me some answers. You know, why have all societies always, ever since Neanderthals, buried their dead? And that's a sign of being human. Did they put flowers? Didn't they? I mean, that's a minor point. And every society around the world. And yet we've sort of lost the plot a bit in Anglo-Saxon society. I feel it's coming around. We're scared.
It's a taboo.
It is a taboo. I think things are on the cusp of changing. And so people like Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, now training to be a death doula and saying we're rubbish at death in this country. But we need to talk about it, have these conversations and think what is necessary, what do we need, what helps us through this very, very hard time in our life. And I've become rather evangelical now about thinking that action in the name of death and ritual and make it up, or, you know, whatever it is, the religions have got a very good...
I think it's incredibly important. And we were just saying, I mean, sense of living
yes,
as well.
They really are. And I think when I've tried to wonder why my dad said nobody but his wife could go to his funeral, I've had different ideas. And I think he probably didn't want things to be complicated.
That's right.
You know, all those
All those
ex-wives and messy relationships and angry people. And
yes.
I get that. But I think if he'd spoken about it with us, with me, I'd have tried to persuade him otherwise. But I would have, I think, persuaded him at least to compromise and said, I need to be there. You know, I need to say goodbye. I've had a whole lifetime, and that's not something that can just be dismissed. And the thing of mattering to somebody and that being shown in their last wishes and their will, all of these things are very, very important.
Yeah. And it must have been a fascinating process at the same time, the getting to know I don't know how well you know your siblings, but if they were all from different mothers, it would have been quite an interesting process to remember your dad on Zoom calls or whatever.
Exactly. That's what we started doing because we were very spread out. So we're basically me and my two brothers from my father's first marriage, then 3 half-sisters from his second marriage, and then there was a youngest brother from marriage. He got married when he was in his 50s to a girl of 18, having only known her a week, which was a very big shock to everybody, although sort of in his tradition of wild living.
Your family, they're great.
They're great coffee. I'm blessed with an interesting family.
You certainly don't have a boring family.
Exactly. It has a terribly sad ending in that my brother, youngest half-brother, died of an overdose aged 27. So he's tragic. No longer alive. It is tragic.
Did you get to know him?
I didn't know him from when he was 3 to when he was 26. And we met again and had such a bond and such a sense of
recognizing
a brother. It was astonishing, really astonishing, so moving. And he had many problems and was very sad at that point in his life. But it was a huge thing to have met him. And then the loss of losing him was a strange sort of loss because I hadn't known him, and yet it was the loss of our future.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. And then you had your own other remarkable story that I couldn't quite get over as well. When it's the subject of one of your other books, Mad Lord Berners, when you inherit this vast pile at the age of 25 and you've never lived there before. That's another extraordinary story. Do you want to tell us?
That was extraordinary in that my mother, her father his nickname was the Mad Boy, and he was the younger partner of Lord Berners.
The one who dyed his doves.
The one who dyed his doves, who was a wonderful composer, writer, painter, and who fell in love with the Mad Boy when he was 48 and the Mad Boy was 21, and took him to live at this beautiful house near Oxford called Farringdon House. And so I grew up not knowing my grandfather. My mother didn't get on with him very well, and she got married as a teenager, age 17, to my father, and we didn't ever go there.
17?
Yeah. She got married at 17, had me when she was 18.
Wow.
So I didn't know this grandfather, and then I was taken there by her to stay a weekend, age 17, and it was a complete revelation because he was this extraordinary man who still dyed the doves, all the different colours of the rainbow, who still had exquisite food from the garden and would take you around the lake, and it was a kind of not at all the way I'd been brought up in London and then outside Oxford. I moved when I was 15. And so that was bizarre. A few years later, for a reason I can never really understand, he decided not to leave the house and the land around it to his beloved nephew, who was all set up to inherit it, but to leave it to his student granddaughter.
Who he had met. You'd obviously impressed him.
We'd got to know, we got on well, but we were incredibly different and our values were so different, and it was not my world, that grand country world. I was living in Greece and I got this phone call to go down from my little flat to the shop of my landlord. And he said, there's a phone call for you. And it was that the mad boy had died. And I had to fly back to England and meet the mad Austrian sort of fascist housekeeper, the disinherited nephew, my mother, who was appalled by the situation, who didn't want me to get tangled in those tentacles. And it was a very, very strange thing to happen, quite a daunting thing.
And did you feel a sense of, you love history, so you probably and you love a story, so probably one side of you quite relished this idea of this incredible historical house and the stories that it could uncover.
Definitely. And I think that was always the best bit of that place for me, feeling that you could lie down on the daybed that Gerald Berners would have chosen the cushions for, or play his piano, or the whole house was imbued with such a sense of history and, what orgies went on in that bedroom, because there was a lot of wild behaviour that went on there in the 30s and onwards. I never lived there very much. There wasn't really the money to run it. I had other lives going on and it wasn't appropriate to me. And I think the truth is that even if I had had the money to go and live there, living in a big house in the English countryside with all that ties you into was not my style. And I've been very lucky to be free enough to go and live in various different countries and have a life unattached to those sort of roots.
And so your life in Athens you feel free. You feel free, unencumbered by...
I do. And after I'd inherited it, it wasn't that long later when I met Vasilis and we fell in love, and I did the crazy thing of going out to live with him in Moscow. So I lived there for a year and a half. Then we lived in England for 4 years and had both our daughters born here. Then we moved to Rome, lived there for 5 years, and after that moved to Athens. So actually I've been outside England, and when I do come back, I like the feeling of being a visitor here. I love being on a London bus and feeling like a tourist, and videoing the sights as I go by, rather than being entrenched in it.
Yeah, I think it's probably the best place to be in England is as a visitor at the moment. I was going to ask you that, did your early life inform your calling as a writer? I mean, the story of your grandmother is unreal. The descendant of Catherine the Great. Do you want to just tell us about her? And she handed you her diary, didn't she?
She did, when I was 16, which I was too young to really appreciate. It was an old Russian diary with a clasp that she'd actually only written in during the Second World War, when she was in Paris, just as the Nazis were about to come in and occupy it. And during the war, having been interned by the Nazis in France, she then became a very determined communist, worked with the French resistance, helped smuggle Jews out of the camp. It was a camp in France that was mainly not a concentration camp, but a group of Polish Jews ended up there. She later returned to England, having been tragically widowed from her second husband. She was then an incredibly determined communist, was tailed by MI5. I went and saw her file in MI5, which was astonishing. It was really thick, full of phone taps, letters opened and copied, to read a transcript of her speaking with my father on the phone during the 50s was a very strange thing to come across, and these police reports getting half of the facts wrong but sort of judging her.
And she was quite promiscuous, wasn't she?
She had many, many lovers, and I mean, promiscuous judges that it was wrong. I mean, she was a very free, ahead of her time woman who thought that women can enjoy sex for its own sake.
Yeah.
And I mean, she did once say to me when I was about 16, have as many lovers as you want to, but just don't have them at the same time.
Well, my Russian grandmother said to me when I married a man who was much older than me that it was my starter marriage. So she was probably the same cut. But your great-grandmother was flying planes and
yes,
and a surgeon.
Yes, her mother. So she was Sofka, I'm named after her. Her mother, Sophie. Same name, really. Sofka's just the diminutive. She, from that sort of background where she would have been expected to be a lady-in-waiting, said, no, absolutely not. I want to become a doctor. She became a surgeon. She learned to drive and was given a car on her 18th birthday. She was probably the first Russian woman pilot. She ended up being a drug addict, managed to get medicines from the hospitals and this sort of thing, and died of an overdose.
There's a film script in her story as well, isn't there?
Yeah.
Have you had lots of people try and make films out of it?
Sadly, no.
I wish we could interest someone. I mean, these are extraordinary lives through an extraordinary era, and I just think it'd be fascinating. So, did you feel as a child, you obviously knew these stories of your extraordinary grandparents, did you feel, I've got to write this down, I've got to become a writer?
No, I don't think I did. And I think the thing about being a child is that you just
don't see them as extraordinary.
You don't see anything very much as extraordinary.
No.
You just take what life gives you as what life is. So I think my childhood was a very interesting one, quite a muddled one. Both my parents were and are, my mother's very much still alive, interesting people who threw behind the old ways during the 60s and became part of that generation of throwing off the chains of conventions. And my father set up this electronic music studio, so the house was filled with very interesting people, both pop groups coming in. So certainly I know Pink Floyd spent quite a lot of time with him, David Bowie.
So it wasn't that you were writing to try and make sense of a sort of peripatetic life. You had a huge sense of belonging and home. You weren't trying to write yourself into an identity or into belonging to anything, because you had that sense.
I did have that sense. I think I always also had a sense of not belonging. I've always been not a very clubby person. And I think that's somehow down to a sense of that I wouldn't fit into a club because I don't belong. And I remember feeling that at school, that I was somehow different. I'm sure I wasn't, but I think I had that idea. What I would say about, I didn't know I'd be a writer, but I think that I was very encouraged by both my parents to be creative. When I was 4 and started going to school, I was asked, I think by my father, but probably both, to bring back a painting every day. And then my parents framed about 20 of my splodgy paintings, made an exhibition going up the stairs in our house in Putney. And I always think that was a sort of foundation stone for me in being trusted to be a creative person. So it could have gone in a different direction. But I did always write. I wrote diaries as a child and as an adult. I don't so much anymore.
Actually, do you have a sense, being a little bit Russian, do you have I was talking to someone else about signs and symbols when people die, and where the innate mysticism in some of the Russians I know. Do you have a sense of feeling they're out there somewhere, giving you some sign of themselves?
It's very tempting, isn't it? People often have that thing of seeing an animal or a bird fly up after somebody's dead. They feel as if they've been born again in an animal. I don't have that so much, but I think that what I do have is a sense of place and a sense of sort of animism in objects. One of the things I found after my father died, and I only later tied it to him having been a geologist at one early point in his life, was stones and holding on to. I had 2 smooth Greek stones that I held in my pockets in the weeks and months after he died that really helped me. It was holding on to something tangible. And a year after he died, we finally managed to get some of his ashes. Our stepmother kindly handed some over, and we met up on this island that he had brought us to and had loved deeply and had mapped as a geologist. And when I was a child, he'd always point at this place when we were driving over a huge hilltop. We'd get to the top and you'd look out and see the coolings of sky and little islands and the mainland. And he'd say, that's where you must bury me, over there on the hill. I think as a sort of metaphorical thing. But when we got the ashes, my lovely nephew, Tom Zinovieff, who's an amazing cabinet maker, made this box that was an oak, very beautiful, well-made little coffin, a little miniature coffin. And we put most of the ashes in that and trudged up the hill to this place and dug a hole, buried him. That's what it felt like. We had our funeral a year later. We also lugged many, many stones, many of them with fossils in them that I'd learnt about really from him because of his geology. And each year when I go back now, I go collecting stones and taking more to this place. And I sit there and think about him and feel
connected.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I feel. I can't say I feel the spiritual, like he's swirling around me in a mist.
No.
But but I feel very connected in a wonderful, inspiring way, and I can think more calmly about a whole lifetime, all those decades that I had with him and all the good things that he offered me amongst the chaos and the difficulties, all the things that I learnt from him.
Did your siblings come with you for this ceremony?
They absolutely did. And there was a lot to thrash out to do with our different emotions, our connections, the overlaps, the privileges of one against the lack for another.
My goodness, yes.
The siblings, there's always, even however much you love them, there's that implicit looking at
child.
Exactly.
Yeah. And different memories, and it's quite
exactly that.
Amazing how you can have even the identical upbringing, but have different memories of your parents, and how you were perceived in the family structure.
So true, and I discovered that more than ever when I wrote my 2 sort of family biographies, both the one about my Russian grandmother, Red Princess, but also the mad boy, Lord Berners, that each person I spoke to or interviewed would give me a different story and a different version. And that's very, very challenging because you have to work out your truth when you're writing. You want to get to the truth, but you also know it's only going to be your truth that you've extrapolated, and it's a complicated conundrum.
And I think you navigate it really well, if you don't mind me saying, both in the fiction and the non-fiction, because you don't judge. You're fairly unflinching in your treatment of quite tricky subjects, such as mothers who are not good mothers and who sleep around occasionally, or children being seduced by older men. All those tricky subjects which you could really have a very strong moral view on, you don't. You give us a story and you let the reader decide. So everyone can read what they want into one of your books.
Thank you. I'm really glad you said that. And I think that there are a number of reasons why I'm like that. I think one is that I was an anthropologist, and that opens your mind to all sorts of different ways of behaving and cultural beliefs. I think also having had certainly a father who behaved what many people would say was badly often, but was very beloved, I think that helps you to walk around subjects and see the other side. And so I do often find myself, when somebody has been deeply criticised about something, I'll find myself going to look for why they were criticised, or are they also victims in some way?
Yeah.
My mother was also a psychotherapist for many years, and no doubt that has fed into the mix as well. And I think it's in my nature, and I'm pleased to be like that, even if it means that sometimes I'm not black and white. But I think with my novel that you were referring to, Putney, which has a 13-year-old girl in love with a much older married man, and he with her, and they have a sexual love affair that she only decades later starts to see as being abuse. Again, I knew at the time I was doing something really risky in having the older man's point of view. But I felt that to write about that subject and not examine it and not get inside his heart and mind as well would have made for a much more boring book.
It's a brilliant novel, my God.
Thank you.
Harrowing and brilliant and unputdownable. I was going to ask you, your grandmother, back to your grandmother, sorry, I'm slightly obsessed by your grandmother. Your grandmother doesn't believe in the importance of tombstones. Was your father like that as well? Maybe he didn't care about the ritual of death. Maybe he just thought it's all pointless and it doesn't really matter. You can remember me in your hearts.
I dare say he might have said something like that. I think he was terrified of death. He was always very, very frightened. He was a terrible person to fly with on an aeroplane because he'd done a little bit of flying as a pilot after university. And so you'd sit there next to him, he'd go, flaps up, engines on, whatever. This is the most dangerous point now where you might have a crash. And he was very, very afraid of dying and didn't want to die, and I think that it made him look away from that, and so he hated going to funerals, and I don't think he gave much thought to those sort of niceties, which is probably how he would have seen it, as did David Bowie, after all, say, I don't want a funeral. But I think, fair enough, don't have a funeral, but then make sure you have a proper gathering and let the people who mattered to you and who you mattered to them express themselves and do things. And I think for me, living in Greece, where, like with the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, which has dominated funerals for, well, millennia, really, there's a very fixed way of knowing what you will do.
Yes,
the funeral will happen very quickly, so you're still in deep trauma when it happens, but at least you're starting on that path, and the church takes care of how that service, that first one, will be. And it can be quite dramatic because of the intense emotions, but that's better than the let's sit around for 3 weeks waiting, I think. And then you have the memorials, so they start at 3 days, 7 days, 9 days, 40 days.
I think it's great.
A year. You have the special food. All of that, for me, seems to make such a lot of sense.
I think so. And in Hinduism, they have a similar thing, the memorials on certain dates after the death, because they say that the transitional period when the spirit is released, or soul is released from the body, the soul is restless and it's trying to find its way into the next realm.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is that the souls of the people who are still alive are restless.
Yes.
And we mourners also need ways of working our way towards peace. And that is a long, rocky road. It's not an easy one. And so you need all the help you can get. my father's closest, oldest friend, who they'd been at school together, lived opposite him and also wasn't allowed to go to the funeral and was very, very upset about this. And he and his wife immediately changed their wills and said, when we die, we want to be laid out in the house for 2 or 3 days so that all of our friends and our daughters and everybody who wants to can come, like they do in Greece. I mean, in Greece it will only be for the first 24 hours probably, or the first night or so, but to recognise that the person is dead. It's like Julia Samuel, who, the wonderful writer and psychotherapist, says that if you don't use your 5 senses to acknowledge death, it's a theoretical thing. So you want to see the coffin or the dead person. You want to smell the flowers. You hear the music or the bells. You touch the earth or whatever it is. And if you don't have any of that, it's like when someone's missing at sea or missing in war. You're left with this vacuum that there's very, very hard to fill. And that's what I felt, of course, in a much more minor way. But I did feel that huge vacuum of not being able to touch something or see or anything to do with my father after he died.
Have people responded in a positive way to this new book?
They really have responded. And what's been extraordinary has been how many people have had shattering experiences after a death, which again has really moved me to feel, yes, it's so important to talk about these things, to express what you would like for a funeral, or what you wouldn't like, or what do your children or your friends or whatever it is, to have these things out in the open, because death has to be a part of our lives. And it's something which is important to face up to. I remember about a year after my father died, my mother said, "Now I'm really sorting out now exactly what I would like to happen when I die," which I thought was really nice and good that she was sort of thinking about it. She went and visited this green field, grave.
Women are better at it than men.
I think that's right. A lot of men want to look away and are afraid or find it, as you said, taboo, or there's something sort of shuddery about the whole idea.
And maybe they feel they're immortal,
Also.
Well, okay then. So, have you thought about your own? What music will you have at your?
Oh gosh,
because you come from a long line of musical people, and you have a daughter who's a singer-songwriter.
I do. Yeah, my older daughter Anna, who lives in London on a narrow boat on the River Lee. She's very musical. My other daughter Lara lives in Athens, so we're very lucky to have one in each place. I mean, I think it will depend where I die. And I also don't necessarily believe in being too prescriptive, because I do think that funerals are for the living. It can be helpful if you, for instance, have a great idea about the music you'd like. I think it's helpful, for example, to talk about with your children or your loved people, do you prefer the idea of cremation or burial? I mean, if I die in Greece, which statistically at the moment is more likely as I'm there more, cremation is only just becoming a thing there, really. And so that immediately takes you away from the traditional sort of funeral. I do, for myself, really like the concept of place. So I think that with ashes, I love the idea of being able to bury them or put them somewhere where you can return.
Yeah, I go around the world saying I'd like to die here. Then I'm going to be scattered in many, many places. So what's the next project?
My next project is going back to non-fiction and writing a book about Athens and how over its 2 centuries as the modern capital of Greece, it's had trauma after trauma, catastrophe after catastrophe that has brought in new waves of people. So I'm really interested how resilient it is as a city, how people have come in from such different places, made it their home, brought in their ways, their food.
It feels to me like a very vibrant city.
It is very vibrant, and I think that it always has been very vibrant, but I think this has been discovered now by outsiders who would, perhaps in those sorts of outsiders in the old days, would have spent a day or two sweltering in August in Athens, hating it and not getting the point of it before going to an island. Whereas these days, there's a whole generation, especially of younger, but all ages of people, who come and stay there for longer periods, who get involved or work there or volunteer there.
And culturally very dynamic. There's a lot going on.
It's culturally so dynamic.
Yeah.
I mean, even through the financial crisis, which was a disaster for so many people and such a brain drain, but many artistic and creative people kept on working. They weren't being paid, but they were putting on plays, giving musical performances, painting,
moving into old buildings and setting up artistic sort of workshops.
Exactly.
So this is going to be a historical book about...
I think it will be
everything.
It will be the present day and walking around Athens and talking to people there now, but with a view looking backwards to how the latest crises and tragedies have been part of a series that have created an extraordinary city.
Oh, well, I really look forward to reading that.
Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure and delight to have you on the episode. Thank you for coming.
It's been a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you. That's all for today's conversation. We'll be back in the new year for another 6 episodes of sparkling conversations with vintage minds. Until then, I'm wishing you all a very happy Christmas. You've been listening to Catherine Fairweather from Oriens. Goodbye.